טוב, בוקר טוב לכולם, תודה שהצטרפתם אלינו לסוף השבוע הזה, וברוכים הבאים למפגש של ידידי הדרמה. התחיל מפגש הלימוד שלנו עם גלן סוונסון, בנושא תרגול חמלה, 4 עמידות שאין להן שיעור ובודיצ'יטה. לפני שלהעביר לגלן את זכות הדיבור, כמה דברים מטעם עמותת ידידי הדרמה. אז קודם כל אנחנו רוצים להזכיר לכולם שהשיעור הזה מוקלט ביוטיוב ומשודר לייב בערוץ היוטיוב של ידידי הדרמה, שאליו אתם תוכלו להיכנס דרך סמל היוטיוב שנמצא בראש דף הבית. מצד שמאל למעלה אתם יכולים לראות אייקון אם תיכנסו לדף הבית. גלן מבקש שתחברו מצלמות ומיקרופונים, בסדר? אז זה מפריע לו, אז בבקשה תעשו מאמץ ותחברו את המצלמות ואת המיקרופונים במהלך כל השיעור. מבחינת שאלות בסוף כל שיעור, תכתבו בצ'אט ואנחנו נקריא את השאלות שלכם. אנחנו גם רוצים להגיד שגם בתקופה הזאת יש הרבה מאוד פעילויות מקוונות של ידידי, ומידע על כל הפעילויות האלה תוכלו למצוא גם באתר האינטרנט וגם בדף הפייסבוק של ידידי הדרמה. כשאת ההקלטות של המפגשים האלה וגם ההקלטות של המפגשים האחרים אפשר למצוא באתר היוטיוב של ידידי הדרמה. חשוב גם להגיד שכל הפעילות של ידידי הדרמה נעשית בהתנדבות מלאה וממומנת על בסיס נדיבות ליבם של המשתתפים. אז מי שרוצה לתת דנה ולתרום גם למורה וגם לפעילות יותר ממוזמן לעשות זאת, או באמצעות פייפל או באמצעות העברה בנקאית. שתוכלו למצוא את הקישור לתרומות נוספים בדף הבית של האירוע הזה, באתר ידידי הדרמה, וגם בהודעת הצ'אט ששלחנו בתחילת המפגש, תוכלו לראות שם יש קישור לפייפל לתרומה. אנחנו רוצים להגיד שההשתתפות במפגשים האלה היא על בסיס תרומה, וללא ציון סכום מוגדר, וזה כדי לאפשר לכל מי שרוצה להשתתף, לעשות את זה בשמחה ולתרום כפי יכולתו ומתוך רצון ונדיבות הלב. וזו גם הזדמנות נהדרת לתרגל נדיבות ולהביע תודה והוקרה גם למורה הנפלא הזה וגם להזדמנות ללמוד ממנו. We'll start now. We are very grateful for this opportunity and would like to wish us all an interesting, pleasant and beneficial meeting. Glen, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Asif. I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone here to this weekend program based on the compassion practice and focusing on particularly 4 Immeasurables and Bodhicitta. The schedule will be as we have been following in the earlier weekend programs. That is, we'll have 3 sessions, first one now starting at 8:30, the last one finishing today at 1:30, and we'll have a 30-minute break between each of the sessions. The session structure will be the same as previously. That is, we'll begin with a guided meditation at the beginning of each session, followed by some presentation of material, another guided meditation, and then at the end, question answer. If you have any questions during the session, then you can at any time write them down in the chat, and then at the end of the session, I'll usually leave about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A, and then any questions in the chat, then Asif will read them out and I'll try and answer them as best I can. The recommended reading for this program this weekend, 2 books by Alan Wallace, the 4 Immeasurables book, and another book, Buddhism with an Attitude, particularly this exchanging self with others practice that we'll be looking at a lot tomorrow. So we'll begin now the first session, and in the first session we're going to be focusing on the practice of loving kindness. And in this session we'll begin with a short meditation just to first settle our body and mind and setting a good motivation for this weekend program. Then we'll give an introduction into the compassion practice in general, and then within the compassion practice in general, then we'll specifically look at loving kindness, what it is and how to cultivate it. We'll do a guided meditation on cultivating loving kindness, some tips for the practice, and then after that, a little bit of discussion about attachment, what it is and how to effectively deal with it, and then time for question answer at the end of the session. And so let's begin with a short meditation to just settle body and mind and set a good motivation. And as I've done earlier with all the guided meditations, during the guided meditations, I'll switch off my video so as not to distract you in the meditation. So if you'd like to find a nice comfortable posture, let's begin. Allowing your awareness to descend into the body. And simply become aware of sensations throughout the body. And if you notice any areas of tightness or tension in any part of the body, then use the out breath to relax and release that tightness or tension. And bringing your awareness to the area of your face, and soften and relax all the muscles in the face. The mouth and jaw, soft and relaxed. And all the muscles around the eyes, soft and relaxed. And in this way, allowing the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. And then we can take 3 slow, deep breaths, maintaining awareness of sensations throughout the body as you breathe. And then allow the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Not trying to control or regulate the breath in any way. Simply allowing it to flow naturally and effortlessly. And then releasing all activities of the mind. And simply allow the mind to come to rest. To come to rest in the present moment. Resting in that stillness. The stillness of the present moment. allowing the mind to remain relaxed, still, and clear. And then setting a positive motivation for attending this program this weekend. And try to make your motivation as expansive as possible. And try to also include others in your motivation. And then keeping this motivation in mind, we can slowly end that meditation and begin our discussions here together today. Within Buddhism, we can talk about the two main wings of practice. In Sanskrit, they're called prajna and upaya. Prajna means wisdom, and this is often referred to as vipassana practice. Upaya is often translated as method or skillful means. It's how we go about our activities in daily life. And so we are to engage in our actions based on the motivation of compassion. So this wing of practice is often called compassion. And so therefore the two main wings of practice is wisdom and compassion. And within the Theravada Buddhist traditions, based on the Pali texts, the wisdom or vipassana wing is about gaining insight into these three marks of existence called impermanence, suffering, and no self. And in the compassion wing of practice, it's really the foundation is cultivating these four immeasurables that we see listed here below. Often in the Theravada Buddhist traditions, these are called the four Brahma Viharas. And then in the Mahayana Buddhist traditions, based on the Sanskrit texts, in the wisdom wing, then we go one step further into this wisdom of emptiness. And as we're going to see particularly tomorrow, then we also on the compassion side of practice, we build on the four immeasurables to this aspiration of bodhicitta. And so the foundation for the compassion wing of practice, and we're going to focus on today, are these four immeasurables, these four qualities of loving kindness, compassion, empathetic joy, and equanimity. Loving kindness in Sanskrit is maitri, in Pali, metta, and it's the wish for all living beings to have happiness in its causes. Compassion, karuna in Sanskrit and Pali, the wish for all sentient beings to be free of suffering in its causes. Empathetic joy, or in other words, mudita in Sanskrit Pali, may they be never separated from the happiness that is free from suffering. In other words, a rejoicing in the positive aspects of ourselves and others. And then equanimity, upeksha in Sanskrit, upeka in Pali, is a mind that is free of attachment to those close to us, free of aversion to those far. And so these are the four qualities that form the foundation of the compassion wing of practice. And we'll be looking at those today and then early tomorrow morning as well. Now, in terms of the Theravada path, the door of entry into the Theravada path, the path to liberation from suffering, is often translated as renunciation. The original Sanskrit term is nisarana, which literally means the aspiration to be free of suffering. So this is what really renunciation means. And so once we cultivate this aspiration for ourselves to be liberated from suffering, we have entered the path to liberation in the Theravada path. And this is really self-compassion, compassion for ourselves. But then in the Mahayana, we sort of expand that motivation to bodhicitta, where we're not only aspiring for ourselves to be free of suffering, but we also aspire to help liberate everyone else from suffering as well. And so this is bodhicitta, the door of entry. If we cultivate that aspiration for full awakening for the benefit of others, then we've entered the Mahayana. And so this is the core of the compassion wing in the Mahayana traditions. And we'll look at that tomorrow. And there are two methods mainly taught to cultivate bodhicitta, what's called the 7 cause and effect method, and the equalizing and exchanging self with others. And within that, the Glen practice. And we'll be mainly focusing on the second one tomorrow. And so therefore, the program for this weekend for compassion training is that in this session, we'll look at the loving kindness practice. The next session, we'll look at the compassion practice. Third session today, the empathetic joy practice. Then the fourth session, the first session tomorrow morning, the equanimity practice. And then the last 2 sessions, we'll be looking at this exchanging self with others approach to cultivating bodhicitta, particularly Glen in the last session tomorrow. And then also in that context of compassion training, we'll be also looking in this session and the next session, how to deal with attachment, because this is really creates an obstacle to loving kindness, and then how to deal with anger in the next and third session, because this is really an obstacle to cultivating compassion. And then in the 6th and the last session tomorrow, we'll be looking at how to integrate all of these various compassion practices into daily life, how to take them into daily life. So this is what we'll be covering in this weekend's program. And so let's go straight then to loving kindness. And to introduce this, I'd like to first read a quote from a great Indian Buddhist master, Shantideva, from the 8th century. And this quote is relevant to not only loving kindness, but to compassion that we're going to look at in the next session. He says, "Those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery. And with the very desire for happiness, out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy." And so when we talk about loving kindness, the original Sanskrit word is maitri, and the Pali term is metta. And it's defined as the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. And so what we see here is that maitri and metta is not an emotion, it's an aspiration. And so therefore, it's better to translate maitri and metta as loving kindness rather than translate it as love, as sometimes is the case, because love for us is an emotion, but maitri and metta is not an emotion. And hence, therefore, probably better to translate that as loving kindness. Now, we already have a desire for happiness, but as Shantideva said, it's often misdirected. He says, out of delusion, we destroy our own well-being as if it were the enemy. So even though we have a desire for happiness, because it's not directed well, we even destroy our own well-being as if it were our enemy. Therefore, if we really want to cultivate loving kindness, we need to know 3 things. We need to know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, and how to cultivate those causes. Because if we don't know those 3 things, then loving kindness, i.e. the wish for ourselves and others to find happiness in its causes, is just words with no meaning. So let's have a look at each one of those 3 points briefly so that we can effectively cultivate that aspirational wish for happiness. What is happiness? The first point. Here we can talk about 2 types of happiness. First, temporal happiness, which is simply another name for our pleasurable experiences. Now, this is a stimulus-based happiness, meaning we receive some stimulus and then we have a pleasant experience because of that stimulus. And therefore, this is often called conditioned happiness. We need certain conditions to come together, certain stimulus to have a pleasant experience. Therefore, by its nature, it's transient, because when the stimulus finishes, the pleasant experience finishes. It's unsustainable because of that, because it'll finish as soon as the stimulus finishes. And it's unreliable in that we can't just have a pleasant experience whenever we want one. It requires a certain stimulus. And if we look at our pleasant experiences very closely, we'll actually come to see they're not even in the nature of happiness. Because if our pleasant experiences were in the nature of happiness, it would mean the more we engaged in them, the more happy we should become. But we know from our own experience that if we overindulge in our pleasant experiences, not only don't they tend to make us more happy, they often induce a lot of unnecessary suffering. For example, classic example, eating too much of our favorite dessert. So it's a relative experience. So this type of happiness is all about what we can get from the world. Whereas the second type of happiness, genuine happiness, or this state of inner well-being, it's a state of inner well-being that does not require any particular conditions or stimulus to be present. So it's not stimulus-based, therefore it's unconditioned happiness. We can be in this state of inner well-being regardless of what's going on around us. And so therefore it is stable, it is sustainable, it's reliable, and it is in the nature of happiness. And this type of happiness is more about what we can bring to the world rather than what we can get from the world. Now, unfortunately, we often hope the first will give us the second. We often hope that our pleasurable experiences are going to give us some lasting, genuine happiness. And therefore, as a result, we end up with a lot of craving and attachment to our pleasurable experiences, trying to hold on to them, trying to make them last. But unfortunately, because of that, that often leads to a lot of worry and anxiety about not getting it, not getting enough of it, or potentially losing it. And then often a lot of frustration when we don't get it, overindulging when we do get it, and then often a lot of dissatisfaction and disappointment when things don't live up to our expectations. And then we feel the reason we are not fully satisfied is we simply just didn't get enough of that. So we simply end up craving for more. And then also, due to that craving and attachment, we end up not enjoying the things we used to enjoy. And we know this well. If there's something we enjoy, but we get it too often, then it doesn't take too many times after getting it where our craving and attachment says, well, sorry, that's not good enough anymore because I want something bigger, better, and different. So craving and attachment's never satisfied. Now, if we don't mistake pleasure for genuine happiness and understand there are two types of happiness, then not only can we strive for genuine happiness in a well-being, but also, therefore, we'll actually enjoy our pleasurable experiences more because we'll let go of the craving and attachment, understanding they're never going to satisfy us, which means when they're there, we'll fully enjoy them. But it's not a choice between these two types of happiness. Unfortunately, often people feel like when they enter a spiritual path, then because they have to choose between pleasure and genuine happiness, and somehow they have to give up their pleasure. But this is a mistaken idea. And it's all to do with this term renunciation. Renunciation, to renounce, to give up, is not about giving up pleasure. It's about giving up an unhealthy attitude to our pleasure. That is, give up our attitude that pleasure is going to give us some lasting happiness. In other words, to simply give up attachment to our pleasurable experiences. We do that, we'll enjoy them more fully. And then what are the causes of this genuine happiness and inner well-being? And here a quote from the Buddha, he says, find out what really constitutes true well-being, and based on this understanding, pursue it. And so what we find here is that in the Theravada Buddhist traditions, based again on the original Pali texts, then we talk about the Noble Eightfold Path, these 8 practices to engage in to find that state of genuine happiness, inner well-being. Whereas in the Mahayana traditions, again, based on the Sanskrit texts, we talk about the 6 perfections practices to achieve this state of genuine happiness of inner well-being. But whether we're talking about the Noble Eightfold Path or the 6 perfections, both of those come down to the same 3 core areas of practice, called the 3 higher trainings of ethics, concentration, and wisdom. These are the causes for genuine happiness. But let's briefly see how the Noble Eightfold Path and the Six Perfections come down to the same three core areas of practice. In the Noble Eightfold Path, we have what's called right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And this can be condensed as ethics. Then we have right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. This can be condensed as concentration. And then we have right view and right thought, which are subsumed as wisdom. In the Six Perfections, the first three, generosity, ethics, patience, can be subsumed as ethics. Number 5 is concentration. Number 6 is wisdom. Number 4, joyous effort, is something we need to apply to all three areas. So therefore, we can see that regardless of whether we're talking Theravada Buddhist traditions, Mahayana Buddhist traditions, therefore, all Buddhist traditions, we have the same three core areas of practice of the three high trainings of ethics, concentration, wisdom, if we are to strive for genuine happiness and well-being. These are the underlying causes that we need to engage in. How to cultivate those causes. So how to cultivate ethics? Avoid harmful behavior with body, speech, and mind. Concentration, or in Sanskrit, samadhi, how to develop single-pointed concentration is through the shamatha practice. We looked at that in the earlier weekend 2 weeks ago. We looked at the shamatha practice. In the Theravada traditions, this is often called jhana practice, same practice, the practice of cultivating a calm, clear, focused mind to develop single-pointed concentration, because this is what is needed as a basis for the wisdom or prajna practice. Again, often referred to in Sanskrit as vipassana, or in Pali, vipassana practice. And here we are gaining insights into the nature of reality, insight into emptiness in the Mahayana, insight into these three marks of existence in the Theravada tradition: impermanence, suffering, no self. And by gaining these insights, we can overcome all of our mental afflictions and suffering, and then find that state of genuine happiness, of inner well-being. In the Theravada traditions, this state of genuine happiness, inner well-being, is often referred to as nirvana. In Mahayana, the goal is referred to as enlightenment. And so this is how to cultivate the causes of happiness. Therefore, if we know what happiness is, that we are mainly striving for this goal of genuine happiness, inner well-being, the causes for that are the three higher trainings: ethics, concentration, wisdom. And then how do we go about cultivating those three causes? Through avoiding harmful behavior, through the shamatha practice, through the vipassana practice. Then loving kindness has meaning. Then we can, from that understanding, we can really develop this aspiration for not only for ourselves to have happiness in its causes, but for others to have happiness in its causes as well. Now, in the texts, in terms of cultivating loving kindness, it's recommended that we cultivate that in 3 stages. So first, or 4 stages, sorry, that first we cultivate it towards friends because it's most easy. Then once we're comfortable there, expand out to include people we don't know very well, the so-called strangers. Once we're comfortable there, expand out to include difficult people, the so-called enemies, the people we don't like. And then eventually to all living beings, which is immeasurable loving kindness. Here the word immeasurable means immeasurable living beings. In other words, all living beings. So immeasurable loving kindness is the wish or aspiration for all living beings to have happiness in its causes. But here we probably need to add one more step at the very beginning, one that's often not mentioned in the text, and that is first cultivate loving kindness for ourselves. Because I think in the modern world, we don't tend to be very kind to ourselves, and so that's where we really need to start. Develop loving kindness for ourselves and then expand out to others. And that's what we're going to do now. We're going to do a loving kindness meditation where we'll start by cultivating this aspiration for ourselves and then move out through these stages, through friend, stranger, difficult person, and so on. So if you'd like to find a nice, comfortable posture, let's do that practice now. We begin by preparing the body, setting the body into a state of relaxation, stillness, and vigilance. A vigilant posture is to keep the back nice and straight. And then at the same time, allow the entire body to become completely relaxed, completely at ease. Using the out-breath to relax and release any tightness or tension in any part of the body. And relaxing more deeply with each out-breath. Allowing the breathing to settle into its natural rhythm. Simply allowing the breath to flow naturally and effortlessly. And preparing the mind, setting it into a state of ease and relaxation. Simply allowing it to come to rest in the present moment. Resting in stillness. Loving kindness is the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness in its causes. And we can begin by cultivating loving kindness for ourselves and then expand out to others. Now, no matter how much mental afflictions are in our mind. That is, no matter how much craving and attachment, anger and jealousy, fear and anxiety, and so forth are in our mind, these mental afflictions are not part of the nature of our mind. They're merely like dirt covering the surface of our mind. And beneath these mental afflictions is the natural purity of our mind. So imagine this inner purity of your mind in the form of a small, white, radiant sphere of light in the center of your chest at the level of your heart. And then arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if I had happiness and its causes. May I be truly well and happy. And then with each out-breath, imagine rays of light radiating out from the sphere of light at your heart and filling your entire body and mind. Imagining it transforms into everything you need to be happy. So with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to yourself whatever you need to be happy, both in the short term and the long term. And then next bring to mind someone close to you, a loved one, and imagine them very clearly in front of you. And arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they had happiness and its causes. May you be truly well and happy. And then with each out-breath, imagine rays of light radiating out from the sphere of light at your heart and filling their entire body and mind. Imagining the light transforms into everything they need to be happy. So with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy in the short term and the long term. And next, bring to mind someone who you know well, but is neither a friend nor someone who you dislike. And again, imagine them very clearly in front of you. They're just like yourself in wanting to be happy. So arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they had happiness in its causes. May you be truly well and happy. And with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy. And then next, bring to mind a difficult person, someone who you dislike. And again, imagine them very clearly in front of you. They are also just like yourself in wanting to be happy. And so arouse the thought, how wonderful it would be if they had happiness in its causes. May you be truly well and happy. And with each out-breath, breathe out the light of loving kindness, sending to them whatever they need to be happy in the short term and the long term. And then release all appearances and simply allow the mind to come to rest in that inner purity of mind, which is in the nature of loving kindness. Rest in that loving kindness. And we can make the meditation come to a close. Some tips for the practice. As we saw earlier, very much recommended when we start this loving kindness practice to start with oneself, particularly if we're suffering from low self-esteem or self-hatred, not feeling good about ourselves. And then expand out through these stages. And when we do this, we can focus on individuals, but also we can focus on groups of people once we get a bit more familiar with the practice. But then the question can arise, well, how to cultivate for difficult people? Because often for these so-called enemies, we often feel like, well, they don't really deserve loving kindness because they're sort of horrible, nasty people. In fact, they deserve to suffer. And the answer is how to be able to cultivate it for them without that resistance is avoid what's called cognitive fusion, wrongly identifying them with their behavior. But we'll talk more about that in some detail today in the third session. And then with this practice, we're doing a lot of visualization. But sometimes people say, well, I find it difficult to visualize, or visualizing light and stuff doesn't really work for me. Clear visualization in this practice is not the most important thing. The visualization just helps to maybe intensify the practice. But if you find it difficult to visualize, or you find that the visualizing the light and so forth doesn't really help, then just repeat that mental aspiration. Rather than imagining the light going out to others, then just on every out breath, may you be truly well and happy. May you be truly well and happy. Just keep repeating that rather than doing the visualization. That's also completely okay. Now, what are some obstacles to this practice? As we're going to see with each of these four immeasurables, there are what's called the far enemy and the near enemy. The far enemy is what's sort of directly opposite to the quality. And here, the direct opposite to loving kindness, wishing people to be happy, is wishing them to suffer, so ill will or malice. And we'll look at how to deal with that in terms of dealing with anger. We'll look at that in the next session. And then the near enemy is actually something that sort of looks like that quality, but actually it corrupts and pollutes that quality. And here, the near enemy of loving kindness is attachment. And we'll look at what now we'll look at what is attachment and how to deal with that. So we'll briefly look at that, and we'll continue to look at that, meditate on that next session. So what is attachment? Attachment in Sanskrit is raga, and in Pali, lobha. And attachment is what's called a mental affliction. The word in Sanskrit for mental affliction is klesha. And a klesha is defined as any mental factors which cause the mind to become agitated or disturbed. And in Buddhist psychology, when the sort of extensive presentation of the mental afflictions is given, we often have a list of 26 so-called 6 root mental afflictions and 20 secondary mental afflictions. They can be condensed down to what's called the 6 root mental afflictions, but they also can be condensed down further into what's called the 3 poisons, the 3 main mental afflictions, which is ignorance, attachment, and aversion. And we'll look at those a little bit more detail later. Now, how is attachment defined? Attachment is a mental factor that sees its object as attractive. It then exaggerates the object's attractiveness and thus wishes to possess and hold it. Why? Because it believes that object is a source of our happiness. And so where does this attachment come from? It comes from our distorted view of reality, particularly the distorted view that there's an independent me here and an independent objective world out there. And from that, when we experience something pleasant, it seems like the pleasantness is coming from the side of the object and it's the source of our happiness. Now, attachment being a mental affliction is to be fully eliminated. But then Does that mean we need to eliminate all of our desires and our passions? Here we need to be careful. These words desire and passion can be used in at least two ways. Sometimes the word desire or passion is simply another word for attachment. Then we need to get rid of that. But also the word desire or passion can have a meaning of aspiration, aspiring to something. And if we're aspiring to something worthwhile, then we need to increase our desire and passion. And so how to distinguish between this aspiration and attachment, we'll look at now in detail. Where does attachment come from? Again, attachment comes from our distorted view of reality. And we distort reality in a number of ways. We tend to see things which are changing as unchanging. We tend to see pleasure as happiness. We tend to see where there is no self, an autonomous self. But at the deepest level, we see things which are dependent as independent. And so that is really the main driving force for our craving and attachment. And so here we have these three poisons, the three core mental afflictions. Ignorance here, avidya in Sanskrit, is at the deepest level, it's ignorance of the nature of reality. It's a distorted view of reality. At the deepest level, it's a grasping to this independent me, independent objective world. And once we grasp that, then the things we experience as pleasant, it seems like they are the source of our happiness. So we end up with attachment to them. And due to that ignorance, when we experience unpleasant things, it seems like they are the source of our suffering. And so we end up having aversion to the unpleasant things. And that's dvesha in Sanskrit. And so we'll have a look at that in the next session, particularly in terms of dealing with anger. Anger is a very strong type of aversion. And so we'll look at what it is and how to deal with it in the next session. But firstly here, how to deal with attachment. The first point is we need to have a clear understanding of attachment. Because as long as we feel like attachment is something useful and that it's sort of actually bringing us some happiness, then of course we're not going to want to get rid of it. We'll just have more and more of it. So we really need to know what it is and how it just simply leads to suffering. Therefore, develop the aspiration to be free of attachment by understanding what it is and the fact that it's just leading to suffering. The second step, important in dealing with attachment, is to cultivate a view of genuine happiness that we saw a little bit earlier in this session. Because now, as long as we believe the source of our happiness and also the source of our suffering is out there in the world, then as long as we have that worldview, then of course, as soon as we see something pleasant, we're going to have attachment because it seems like it's the source of our happiness. Whereas if we can cultivate the view of genuine happiness, understanding that not only is the source of happiness not out there in the world, but also the source of suffering is not out there in the world, it lies within our own mind, then we'll want to get rid of attachment because we'll see that attachment is just causing us suffering and it's interfering with striving for genuine happiness. And how to cultivate this view of genuine happiness comes within Buddhism in the context of what's called the preliminaries, the foundation practices. And we'll look at those a little bit later this weekend. What are these preliminaries that will be helpful in terms of providing a basis for being able to deal with not only attachment, but anger and other mental afflictions? Then actually how to deal with attachment as it's arising. Then the first step is mindfulness, to use mindfulness, to notice it when it's first arising. Because now we don't tend to notice attachment until it's got control of our mind, and then it's very difficult to do anything because attachment's already taken control of our mind. So then the only real thing to do at that stage is to separate from the object so that we can dissipate the attachment. But here we have a little bit of a window of opportunity from when we first see the pleasant experience until attachments arising, until attachments taking control of our mind. That window of opportunity may only be a second or two. But if we've cultivated some mindfulness through the shamatha practice, we'll be able to take advantage of that window of opportunity. We'll notice when attachment is first arising and we're still in control of our mind. And then what we can do is simply watch that attachment. Because if we can watch the attachment, we're free of it. It has no power over us. It can't do anything. It will simply dissipate. We don't need to fight with attachment. If we try and fight with attachment, that's like throwing petrol on the fire. We're still identifying with the attachment. So the simple solution is simply step back and watch the attachment, observe the attachment. Because if we can observe it, we're free of it. We're no longer caught up in it. We don't need to fight with it, and we're not feeding it. Because whenever we're caught up in attachment, we're feeding it. But if we step back and watch attachment, we're not feeding it. It can't go anywhere. It can't do anything to us. It will simply dissipate. So this is a very effective method of dealing with attachment. Just observe it. However, in addition to that, we can also do what's called apply antidotes to attachment. And here, often these antidotes come within the wisdom or vipassana side of the practice. In particular here with attachment, impermanence. If we come to an insight into impermanence in vipassana practice, and to come to see experientially that things around us are changing moment by moment, everything is simply a flow, then there's nothing to grab. There's nothing for attachment to grab hold of. And so attachment will dissipate. And so this is often in the meditation text is listed as the antidote to attachment is impermanence. However, intellectual understanding of impermanence is not enough. I mean, we all have that already. To be able to effectively use this antidote, it needs to be experiential, i.e., we need to engage in vipassana practice. And at a deeper level, the vipassana practice of emptiness is going to be very helpful here, because all mental afflictions like attachment comes from distorted view of reality, comes from ignorance. And so if we've engaged in the vipassana practice of emptiness and start to reduce that ignorance, to let go of that grasping mind, then we can start to experientially see that the beauty is not there in the object, that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And therefore, there's nothing for attachment to grab because the underlying ignorance is not there. And so this is a very powerful antidote to attachment. And so therefore, and we're going to do this in the beginning of the next session, is to meditate on some of these ways of dealing with attachment, become familiar with them, and then applying them in daily life. But here we see that to be able to effectively deal with attachment, we need to have an integrated approach to our practice. We need to really engage in those preliminary practices to cultivate view of genuine happiness. We need to engage in shamatha practice to really strengthen our mindfulness, to be able to watch attachment when it arises. And then we need to engage in vipassana practice so that we can effectively apply antidotes to attachment. And so here we can see that in the context of dealing with attachment within compassion wing of practice, then the other areas of practice of preliminary shamatha vipassana is very important. And so this is something we'll briefly touch on in the last session tomorrow, this importance of having an integrated approach to be effective in any area of practice. And so that's all I wanted to cover in this session. We'll do a meditation on dealing with attachment and in the beginning of the next session. And I also want to look at some misconceptions regarding attachment in the next session. But now it's some time for question and answer. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and Asif will read them out. So do we have any questions yet in the chat?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
So Omri is asking, how do we make sure that we don't use the practice as a way of escaping the difficult reality of our life instead of dealing with it?
Particularly the shamatha practice could do that. I mean, if we have the shamatha practice, we could use shamatha practice as a way of withdrawing from the world. And so that could happen. But that's doing shamatha practice in isolation. That's why, again, if we have an integrated approach to practice, covering all these bases of the preliminaries, shamatha, vipassana, and compassion, then that won't happen. Particularly if we've first established a strong basis in the preliminaries, where one of the preliminaries there is not only reflecting on precious human life and death, but to develop the view of genuine happiness. And so if we really cultivated that experientially and really experientially see that the source of my happiness and suffering is not out there, it lies within my own mind, then what are we running away from? Whereas if we haven't done that, then if we think that the source of happiness and suffering is out there, then I need to run away from all that suffering out there. Oh, this practice here can help me run away. Let's use that to run away. And so this can happen. And this is a symptom of doing not an integrated approach to practice, just picking a particular practice and using that as a way of withdrawing from the world. And so that's not very healthy. But again, if we have an integrated approach, particularly if we have established a strong foundation in these preliminary practices, particularly this view of genuine happiness, then that's not going to happen, because then all of the practices of shamatha, vipassana, compassion are the practices that we're using to strive for genuine happiness, not as a way of withdrawing or running away from all that stuff out there in the world. Rather, we'll be using them to be able to be better in the world, to provide more benefit to others. Okay. Any more questions?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. While we're waiting then, on this attachment, at the beginning of the next session, we'll do a meditation looking at some ways of dealing with attachment. And then we will look at some misconceptions regarding attachment and how to overcome those misconceptions. So that'll come in the next session, beginning of next session, particularly because we often feel like, attachment is something useful that's actually giving me happiness. And one common misconception that we'll look at next session is that, I need attachment to have a relationship. If I don't have any attachment, how can I have a relationship? So that's something we'll look at in the next session. Any questions yet?
Yeah, so Ilaya wants to know how not to confuse self-compassion with cherishing the self.
Mm-hmm. This topic of self-cherishing, we will look at in detail tomorrow. But just a short answer here is that self-cherishing is coming from the self-grasping. It's coming from this putting me first attitude. And so this is coming from ignorance. And so again, if we here in this particular case, if we are also engaging the two main wings of practice of wisdom and compassion. And so if we don't engage in the wisdom wing, compassion on its own could end up like that. And we'll look at some dangers later. I think it comes this afternoon in the third session or maybe tomorrow. We'll look at some dangers of only engaging in compassion without wisdom. And we'll also look at some dangers of only engaging in wisdom without compassion. We find that again, we need an integrated approach that if we don't have an integrated approach, we only do one or the other, compassion or wisdom, we can end up in problems. And here with compassion, without wisdom, then definitely this is one thing that you could slide into, not only in terms of being selfish, but also being biased in that I'll help these people over here because they're nice people, I like them, but these horrible, nasty people over here, I'm not going to help them because, in fact, they're nasty people. I hope they suffer. They deserve to suffer. So that's a classic example of trying to engage in compassion without wisdom. We can become very biased in our way of helping. And even if we have a good motivation to help others and we don't have wisdom, and we probably all know this from our own experience, that sometimes we really genuinely try to help others with a good motivation and we make a complete mess of it and we just create a lot more suffering. And so this is another example of compassion without wisdom. The compassion is blind. So these are things like the selfishness and so forth is then lack of wisdom. But also one thing that we can look at here is, again, the preliminaries, is that if our view of happiness is the source of my happiness is out there, then it'll be a me first attitude because there's limited resources out there. I need those resources to be happy, get everyone else out of the way. Whereas if you, in the preliminaries, cultivate a view of genuine happiness, then instead of being competitive with others, because we're fighting for limited stuff out there, then we'll actually cooperate with others because we'll understand the source of happiness comes within. So again, the preliminaries here, the view of genuine happiness is going to be very helpful in avoiding self-compassion degenerating into selfish state of mind. But we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. Any more questions?
Yeah, Muli says there are teachers who prefer not to teach metta practice as it can encourage desire. Better to practice compassion. Does this make sense?
Well, metta or loving kindness and compassion are really the two sides of the same coin. I mean, they're really looking out for the welfare of ourselves and others. Loving kindness is focusing on the positive, the genuine happiness. Compassion is focusing on the freedom from suffering. But we end up in the same goal. The only danger with, again, we're already starting to address it and we'll talk more about it next session, is with the loving kindness, as I just briefly mentioned, the near enemy of loving kindness is attachment. So if we don't know what attachment is and how to distinguish it from loving kindness, then yes, loving kindness could simply turn into an attachment practice. We're boosting our attachment. So therefore, rather than not doing loving kindness because of this potential danger, then simply identify what is the danger and how to deal with it. And so not to allow that to be polluted by the attachment. So we've started to mention that already, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next session.
Okay, thank you. Dror says, having compassion for everyone seems to lead for one to help everyone. Doesn't that make our resources too thin? Feeling that there are so many things yet to do, which might discourage us from acting.
Yes, so again, this is wisdom. So one of the dangers with, and we'll talk about this compassion, there's actually, that's going to come up in the third session today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what's called compassion burnout, and this is a classic example of compassion lacking wisdom. For example, the wisdom of knowing what we can do to help, what we can't do to help, and the wisdom of knowing when to rest and look after ourselves. Because if we push ourselves too much and become physically and mentally fatigued, then we're no use to anyone. So that's not compassion. That's so we just need to add wisdom, and then there's no problem there. But also, actually, and I'll talk about this later today, you know, we often then talk about compassion burnout, but actually there's technically no such thing as compassion burnout. What we're going to see this afternoon, it's empathy burnout. And again, it's the reason there's a burnout is that lack of wisdom. That when we have a lot of empathy, when we see a lot of suffering around us, and we see it's like it's hopeless, then we get overwhelmed and we burn out. But again, if you simply add wisdom to that, then instead of having empathic distress and burning out, that will actually lead to compassion, doing whatever we can to help others without burning out. But we'll talk more about that in the third session today. If there's any more questions, we've got time for maybe for one more question, if there's any more.
No one wrote yet. We can wait a bit, or we can end.
We can wait a minute or so if anyone's got a question. Otherwise, then it's nearly time for a break anyway. So we'll just wait a minute if anyone's got a question, and then we'll take a break if no questions. Okay, seems like there's no more questions. So the next session now, we'll take a 30-minute break. Next session, we'll go to compassion. But as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll do a meditation on dealing with attachment and dispel some misconceptions regarding attachment. And then we'll go on to looking at the actual compassion practice itself. But let's take a break now and come back in 30 minutes.